Okay, an apology up front because there seems to be really bad sound from me during this whole episode. I don't know why that is, but hopefully I'll find a way to stop that from happening in the future. So I apologise, but I sound like Robo Marv all the way through this. Anyway, hope you still enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to Pods Like Us. I'm Martin Quibell, known to my friends as Marv, and with me this time I've got Antony Rotunno from Glass Onion, a John Lennon podcast. How are you, Antony?
I'm doing very well, Martin. How are you? How's your new adventure going? Is it going well?
Like I said to you before we recorded, I'm getting better all the time.
Good luck to you. I'll just say that now.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I'm putting all of these out in order so that people can see me going from absolutely terrible to slightly better.
To legendary by the end of it.
Yes, I'll be an expert. So, how were you introduced to the world of podcasting in the first place?
I actually got introduced to the world of podcasting. It was when I lived in London about 10 years ago. I used to work with activists. I was quite interested in things like that. And I don't know when podcasts exactly started, but when I got into it, they were a sort of alternative, almost an alternative news source, which I suppose they still are. But I think in those days you had more of a clear alternative media to the mainstream media. I think now you've got sort of a lot of crossover. So, for example, the Joe Rogan Experience, when it first started, was not quite what it is now. I mean, I think he's still maintaining his integrity, but it was very much an alternative. So that was how I got into it. And I just thought it was wonderful. It was like listening to the radio, but not having to listen to all the bits you weren't interested in. It was getting straight to all the good bits. So I just became an addict I became a podcast addict pretty quickly. And so sort of through alternative media, I'd say, originally.
So from there, how did you first think about starting a podcast, and how then did you get it started?
I mean, I had it in my mind for years. I mean, like I say, I started listening to podcasts probably about 2010, perhaps, or 11. And I just had it in my mind for ages because I was born in 75, so I've been into the Beatles since sort of the late 80s, since I was about 13 or 14. Fairly hardcore, really. And it just been in my mind for ages, and I procrastinated, and I had, some technophobia to get over with. And it was about the end of 2018. I just thought, oh, you've really got to do this. And one of the things was that I started contacting people, and I contacted Rod Davis, who was one of the original Quarrymen. And he immediately said, yeah, no problem. We'll do an interview, or, I prefer to call them discussions, but whichever word you want to use. And I thought, well, yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah. And I was thinking, and he said, yes. And I thought, well, if one of the Quarrymen's willing to talk to me, I've got to do this. And I just did it. I ummed and ahed a little bit, but once I'd recorded the thing with Rod, and I I had a few more ideas. I had sort of 5 or 6 people in mind at the beginning, and I had the idea of sort of using some of my psychology knowledge to bring another angle to the John Lennon discussion. So it kind of went from there, and I did the interview with Rod January 2019. So coming up for 2 years since I started.
Crikey, you've grown really quickly then, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean it's these kind of things. They tend to grow by osmosis to some extent, but I did a fair amount of marketing. I mean, marketing is not something that comes naturally to me at all. I kind of hate it really, but I suppose doing it online, it's a bit easier than having to sort of go out in the street and give out flyers and do stuff like that. But once I started, you will absolutely find this. Once you started and you hit your stride and you realize how much fun it is and how rewarding it is. I had all this accumulated knowledge, and at some point I just said, you got to go for it. So I started becoming a bit better at marketing the podcast. But the amazing thing, really, another one of the inspirations was the fact don't seem to be any other John Lennon podcasts. I mean, Jude Kessler had one called the John Lennon Hour, which is still online, but she's got another show now called She Said, She Said. So I think I'm the only sort of specialist John Lennon one. So that was big motivation as well. And I suppose, obviously, the name John Lennon is going to attract a certain amount of people to podcasting. So I'm fortunate in that way. But, it's just been loads of fun, and it tends to grow naturally. And once you know people, of course, and listeners will start listening to a lot of the similar shows, then they learn of your podcast by then. But, however good the show may be, you have to let people know about it. So there's a certain amount of marketing involved as well.
Well, there is quite a family of Beatles-related podcasts around there, aren't there, that are friendly with each other?
Absolutely, yeah. Yep.
So how would you describe your show to people? Because it's not just looking at John's music. There's more to it. There's the psychology and everything else, which is completely fascinating.
I suppose, they have this expression in America, deep dive, which has become very popular, particularly with podcasts, because obviously podcasts, there's no restriction on length. So there's one podcast I listen to called Those Conspiracy Guys, and they have episodes of up to 8 hours. So I listen at 1.5 speeds sometimes. But it's a passion project. I think the thing that perhaps marks mine out from some other ones is that I personalize. And I haven't really done too many solo episodes. I've done, 4 or 5, but episode 36, which was episode 35 was looking at John Lennon's assassination, and then episode 36 was quite a serious deep dive into kind of associations. It's a bit much to go into at the moment, but it's a deep dive and it's very personal, and it's a real catharsis for me, to be honest. That's one of the other things. I never really set out to do a kind of slick radio show. I was inspired by, Joe Rogan and other people. In those days, Joe Rogan's show, 2.5 hours was a long podcast. Now I don't think it's that long. A couple of mine have been 2 hours. So I'd say it's a passion project and a real deep dive into John Lennon, like you said, using psychological knowledge, I'd say.
Yeah. A bit like when you had Ben, who I've already talked to, Ben Bull, you had him on, and that was really interesting because you were talking about the things that John had in common with Bob Dylan and vice versa, and that was a fascinating discussion as well.
Yeah, Ben's great. We got on really well, and he's obviously a professional DJ, so I knew that he'd be a good guest and he'd know what he was doing. That was an interesting conclusion that we sort of reached. That maybe Lennon and Dylan were a little bit too similar in some ways, so they were kind of a threat to each other. So, when I say psychology, it's not really, just in case people are going to be put off by, the idea of using lots and lots of psychological concepts. It's more like a deep dive, It's more just looking that little bit further, because I think the facts of John Lennon, even though they're changing, as we're finding, with all these great Beatle books and podcasts coming out, what we thought we knew may not be the case. But I think a certain number of facts are already well established. So I think looking deeper into them is the way to sort of forward the discussion, I'd say. Yeah.
I think John sort of had a way of fueling that mystery that was there anyway. I don't think that John was always 100% showing who he really was anyway.
Yeah, I mean, when you'll obviously know the Lennon Remembers interview, the December 1970 interview. I think certain books on John Lennon have really kind of taken him at his word. But, as he said to George Martin when they met at the Dakota about a year before John Lennon died, he said, I was off my head, when I said that. Or, and Hunter Davis, who wrote the only authorized biography of the Beatles, I don't know if this was word for word, but he said that John Lennon said to him that, sometimes I just make stuff up. Well, not make stuff up, but sort of come out with stuff off the top of my head. And that's why one of the things on the show that we've concluded was that if John Lennon was around now, he'd spend a long time writing angry tweets to people and then having to apologize for them. He's a very impulsive guy. But I was going to say in that Lennon Remembers interview, he called, Paul the great PR man, but I think John wasn't too bad at that himself. He told a few porky pies, as we say in England, a few lies.
He did.
About his guitar being hung up for 5 years and all that kind of thing. But, it's a game. I mean, John Lennon also said in interviews, that the music industry, like life, is a game. So, you have to be a bit canny every now and again. Yeah.
We all know that he touched his instruments during those years because there's footage of it, video and sound recordings as well.
Absolutely, yeah. It's this bootleg between the lines. I think it was in the Philip Norman book, and in fact, Ken Womack just sent me a PDF of his book because I'm going to be talking to him soon. He's just written a book called John Lennon 1980, and in his book he talks about a Fender Stratocaster that John Lennon had on the wall that he didn't touch. But so I think, I'm not a famous rock star, but imagine if you're a public figure, you kind of you I don't know, spin the story slightly. I mean, nowadays John Lennon would, like any rock star, would have a PR machine behind him, probably literally not telling him what to say, but advising him on, in those days, I think it was a bit more sort of Wild West. It wasn't quite as controlled as it is now, but, he wasn't lying as such, but sort of spinning stories. I think he was good at that, and Paul's good at that.
So, about that 1970 period of John where he was being interviewed, I think you're right. I think that the problem with that is that John was he was still very sore about his falling out with Paul specifically, where obviously his answers to questions people were asking would be very anti-Paul because he was very angry with Paul at that time. Whereas over the years, that softened, and he they became friendly by the time that Toot and the Snore came about in 74, was it?
74, yeah. I'm not sure if they were ever like super friendly after that. Well, I mean, again, we don't know. I mean, I don't know if they met too much in the 70s. When they met in 76, we know. And, there's that wonderful TV movie called Two of Us. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's wonderfully kind of, it's very much a TV movie, and it plays with the facts a bit. But I thought the guys who, what's his name? Jared Harris and Aidan Quinn did a fabulous job as John and Paul. I'd highly recommend that. I think that's on YouTube, actually.
I need to watch that because I like the actors as well.
Yeah, it's really good. What was the question? Yeah, 1970. Well, I mean, you can't really talk about that interview without talking about primal therapy. And I've always had a big interest in mental health. I mean, I've had therapy myself. I've read the Primal Scream, the Yanoff book. I mean, that is heavy duty stuff. You need to have pretty heavy issues to do primal therapy. I mean, it wouldn't be recommended for everyone. So I think, he'd really plumbed the depths of his soul and all his hurt. And I think it was a combination of, everything that he sang about in the song Mother, the mother and father leaving him. And Paul, I think in a funny way, this is really conjecture on my part, but perhaps the primal therapy almost reduced him back to a child, sort of temporarily. Because if you listen to the audio, I think the written version of the Lennon Members interview sounds. I think I've got this right way around. People have said that the audio version doesn't sound as cutting as the written version. Maybe it's the other way around. I can't remember, but he does. When he goes off on one, he does sound a bit like a child, like a wounded child. So, but really, like I say, I wish they wouldn't always use that for these documentaries, because I think that was one period of his life, and I think, coming out of primal therapy, he was in a very, very fragile and a very kind of heavy state of mind.
What would you say is the importance of the guests that you have, and how do you go about arranging those guests?
I mean, the guests are very important because, like I say, out of I think I'm on 52 shows now. I've only done 5 or 6 solo, so the vast majority have been the guests. I mean, I would say that the majority of people I've talked to, before I've talked to them, I've been able to listen to podcasts that they've been on, or, there might be interviews on YouTube, or I'd say the vast majority I've already heard them speak. So I'd have some idea of, their style or what they're going to say. And I mean, yeah, they're very important. I mean, I suppose being an English teacher, I've been an English teacher for the last 17 years, and I suppose I've become good at establishing rapport with people. So I'd say that's one of my strengths. So I think the rapport thing is important. And one thing I do, I sometimes, especially if it's quite a complicated topic, I'll have like a prelim discussion. And Jason Barnard, who you've already talked to, he and I planned to have a sort of 20-minute prelim discussion. I think we were about an hour and a half just having a chat about what we were going to talk about. So that's quite important. So the rapport thing is very important. As much as finding them, like you say, now I'm in the family, so to speak, the Beatles podcast family. Yeah. It's not difficult to find people, and I have issues with social media. I could easily criticize it for certain things, but you can't deny that it's a very good way to sort of gain access to people. Dan Richter, for example. I mean, Dan Richter not only lived with John and Yoko, but he was, if you and the listeners know the film 2001: A Space Odyssey, he's the ape at the beginning who throws the bone into the air, yes, which then turns into a spaceship. The most famous jump cut in the history of cinema. That guy was on Facebook. I saw that we had mutual friends. I said, "Hi, Dan." 5 minutes later, he's agreed to be on my show. I mean, can't be bad, can it?
That's good.
So it's just so easy to access people, and I haven't really found anyone who's sort of been difficult. I mean, even if they were difficult, they wouldn't want to look difficult. So it's just been very easy. But to answer your question, yeah, it's very important, and I kind of establish the rapport before we start recording. That's one of my tricks, if you want to call it that.
Would you say it's a bit like I was talking with Tom and Andy from Two Legs previously, and they were saying that in a way with the guest, it's more about they've actually got the information, and it's just you've just got to glean that information out of them.
Possibly. I think, as we were saying earlier, I see it more as a discussion. So I don't tell the guests specifically, but I do say to the guests, if you'd like to kind of go on a tangent or chuck a question back at me, feel free. So I don't know if I totally agree with that. I think it just depends on the style. I think the guys from Two Legs, they often have authors on. So they had, for example, is it Paul Salowitz? Is it Chris Salowitz?
That's it.
Yeah. I think if you've got an author on who's written a book, for example, or someone who's quite a big name, then I think that although it can still sound like a discussion, that's perhaps a bit more of an interview because you've got the star, if you want to call it that. But I don't think, Dan Richter is a fairly well-known name, but I don't think I've had sort of, this will sound really bad. I don't mean to demean
Sorry, I think I put the question across.
Yeah. That's all right. It's all right. I don't mean to demean any of my guests, but what I'm saying is that I haven't had any big stars, hugely well-known public figures. I think if I did, or I had sort of high-profile authors, I think it might go a bit more like that. But I try and make it kind of 50-50 if I can.
What I meant was that what he was saying was that they pick guests who've already got that knowledge there, so that makes it easier. So they've got that knowledge to be able to fall back on, like when they're talking to. So when they did this show about, working with George Harrison or something, and they had Ken Womack on, and they said because Ken had actually written 2 books about George, that knowledge was already there. So the guests that you pick, they've got that knowledge. They're all ready to help to make it easier.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Ben Burrell's a great example because he although I'm a pretty big Bob Dylan fan, he does a podcast about Bob Dylan, as you well know. So he's probably more of a Dylan scholar than I am. So that was a really nice one because I had more Lennon knowledge than him. He was a fan of John Lennon, but so it was very nice. And I recorded a show actually with a fella called Ghosty. It hasn't gone out yet. I don't know if you know him, but he's a radio DJ as well. And he's a big Elvis fan. So I did a sort of John Lennon Elvis talk, which hasn't got out yet. And it was a similar thing. Ghosty knows a lot about John Lennon, but it's nice if, you can sort of, you and the guest can fill in each other's gaps, so to speak. I think that works really well. But certainly everyone I've spoken to has been highly knowledgeable about their subject. So yeah. But definitely I consider the conversation a kind of a team effort,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You can throw any questions back at me as well, by the way.
Oh yeah.
I don't mind. Okay. So what guest would you love to have that you've not had yet?
Ooh, interesting. I've got a fairly big list. I was in talks with a lady called Helen Anderson who went to art college with John Lennon.
Okay.
And although Helen is apparently I haven't met her in the flesh, but people who've met her said she's still in very good health. She is 80 or late 70s. So these people, unfortunately, are not going to be around forever. So I don't want to put pressure on her, but I'd like to get her on the show at some point. I think the guests, it's not specific guests, but I'd like to get a couple more psychology professionals on the show. I had Dr. Kirk Honda. That was a good episode. We talked about, the certain psychological issues that John Lennon may have had, although we took pains to say we weren't diagnosing John Lennon. But there's plenty of people. One interesting thing is that this will sound ridiculous, but if somebody put me in touch with a sort of very famous person, I almost feel like that wouldn't work as well, because the fact that people I've had on my show are well known, but they're not huge names, that works in my favor, because I feel like, obviously if Paul McCartney wants to come on, open invitation, Paul, but he's probably going to be quite guarded. And the other thing is that people who've done 100 or 200 interviews before, they're going to find themselves falling into the same pattern of answers. So I think the fact that the people I've had on aren't famous has really worked in my favor. So to answer your question, I'd say a couple more psychology professionals would be good. And I also tried to contact Rod Murray through Helen Anderson. He's another one who went to art college. I'd be fascinated to talk to anyone who knew Stuart Sutcliffe. I mean, that would be a real coup. Yeah.
How do you decide the topics that you're going to talk about?
I mean, my ideas generator never really stops going. I have to kind of temper it sometimes. I've just got loads of ideas. I mean, I started off, as I said earlier, when I did the show, with sort of 10 or so ideas. And, you know, when I sit down with a piece of paper and try and think, oh, what topics do I want to cover? It just, you know, I just end up kind of, my brain runs away with itself. And so I don't have any trouble with that. I mean, I've kept thinking sort of the last 6 months that I'm going to eventually run out, but it doesn't really seem like it. I mean, I've already recorded enough shows. We're here at the end of September and got enough shows until the end of the year already recorded. So I just think, you know, I guess one thing I look at is what gaps are there, because although I do listen to other Beatles shows, you know, it's a hell of a lot of time doing my own one with researching and recording and editing. But, you know, I sometimes have a look at, you know, Talk More Talk or the other solo ones to see what John Lennon topics perhaps they're not covering. So, you know, but you're always trying to find little gaps. And I think the psychology one is the gap that other people perhaps don't explore in big depth. Yeah.
How exactly do you do that research?
I mean, a lot of the information's kind of already there. You know, as I said, I've had a lot of accumulated knowledge. But, you know, books, I mean, obviously, if there's an author, I mean, I had Ken McNabb on last year, very, very nice fellow, by the way, and his book, And in the End, that was a case where it was a new book. So I obviously ordered the book, I read it and took notes as I was reading. But a lot of it, we did a show about 1972, which was John Lennon's sort of the height of his sort of new left politics. So I reread the wonderful book Come Together by John Wiener. So I'd say books, obviously internet research. One of the things that has proved quite popular in my show is audio clips. And I get those from YouTube. I've got a massive audio archive. I mean, I used to collect bootlegs and so I had CDs and I made them all into MP3 files. So I've got a pretty huge archive of audio materials. But yeah, basically books and internet research, really. And yeah, and listening to other people's podcasts, of course, and nicking a few ideas. Yeah.
I can't remember that quote.
Don't make that the headline, all right?
Do you actually structure each episode and do you have it pre-written out or is it a stream of conscious?
It's somewhere in the middle. When I do solo episodes, obviously the responsibility for the conversation is all on myself, so that would be a bit more. But I don't think I've ever written out sentences. I don't work from a script. I mean, I know, as you said, Ben Burrell, he produces audio essays for his podcast, and I mean, they sound great. You know, I'm not knocking that at all. But at the same time, I use prompts basically. So if it's you may have heard some of them. I've been doing a kind of a series, John Lennon in, you know, and we've done 66, 65, 72, 1980, etc. With those ones, I research the events of the year, which tends to always be dominated by Vietnam. You know, years like 66, 72, you know. So obviously, yeah, I research world events, so I'd have them written out. But with the guest, you know, I trust myself and I trust the guest and I trust the rapport we have, that a lot of the conversation will just kind of carry itself. And the other thing is I spend a lot of time, I edit it pretty carefully, which is, you know, I probably spend almost too long editing. I'm perhaps a bit too perfectionist, but so something in the middle. Yeah, I have prompts and I kind of, there's a certain element of trust, I think, I could say, with me and the guest, that the conversation will flow. Yeah.
How do you actually edit and record the show then?
I use the cheapest equipment available. I, I'm looking at my wonderful mic here. This is a Blue Yeti, it's called. I think the company is Blue and the type is called Yeti, and then I use Audacity. And it hasn't failed me too badly. And I have a sock on my microphone for a pop filter. That's how down home it is. But no,
that's okay, because the studio I used to work at, when I used to work in a recording studio, we used to use we used to basically buy tights as pop shields.
Right. Well, yeah, tights are traditionally, they are traditionally used as a pop filter. Yeah, you're right. I mean, I probably still have a little bit of a technophobia, so it's a bit, maybe it's a bit of a cop out that I'm still using this, but maybe I'll upgrade at some point. But I'm comfortable with it. It's all right. And I used to use Skype, but I tend to use Zoom nowadays because despite what they tell you, if there's two of you in a Zoom conversation, there's no time limit. And weirdly enough, in fact, I recorded a show with two other people. So there were three of us in the conversation, and it didn't kick us out after 40 minutes. We did 2.5 hours. And then after the end of the conversation, when I'd logged out, it said it tried to get me to upgrade so I could get more than 40 minutes, but it just let me have 2.5 hours. So I couldn't quite work that one out. But yeah, sort of Zoom and Audacity and a Blue Yeti mic served me well.
And I'm stuck with a cheap thing that I bought from Asda.
From where, sorry?
I think I bought a cheap one. Did I get it from Asda or something? There are other supermarkets, by the way, which irritates the heck out of me because I've got these really nice Shure and these really professional microphones that I can't use in a computer.
Oh, yeah. Well, I had a bit of trouble recently, actually, with someone recorded our discussion on very professional equipment. And when I transferred it to Audacity to start editing it started crackling. So I think maybe sometimes expensive stuff and cheap stuff don't always sync together. I don't know. But there's a certain amount of trial and error in all these things,
How did you discover the Beatles and John?
Well, I mean, growing up in England, as you'll know, the Beatles are always going to be around, But yeah, in the 80s, I would say pre-anthology, obviously the anthology was mid-90s, there had been a bit of a drop-off in interest of the Beatles. So although they were around, I credit my older sister, Marina, who probably doesn't listen to my podcast, but, it'd be nice if she did, but hi to her if she's listening. It was the Oldies and Goldies album, which was a compilation that they originally brought out in Christmas '66 because they didn't have a Christmas record that year, and the Ray Coleman John Lennon biography, and also the Imagine 1988 film. It was a combination of those things, and I was just captivated. I mean, with the Oldies and Goldies, I think the thing that really made me take notice was, this is in the 80s, and 80s pop wasn't bad, but tended to be sort of quite long drawn out. I was listening back to some of it recently, and I always felt like the singles were always 30 seconds to a minute longer than they needed to be. Yeah. So when I suddenly heard She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand, it was just this explosion of energy. And the fact that it had been happening 25 years earlier before I was born, it almost added to the magic of it. It was like, wow, I knew the Beatles, obviously I knew the name, but I never knew this. And then on the same record, you had Eleanor Rigby and Yesterday and Michelle, and you're like, wow, how could this possibly be 2 years later? And then I heard Strawberry Fields and I'm the Walrus, and I'm like, what? It was just crazy. And so I'd say that. And then with John Lennon, I had the John Lennon collection, which was an early compilation, and the Imagine '88 film, and I was just absolutely captivated. And this is very cliched, but when I got the Ray Coleman book, I started reading it, and I used to go home for lunch on my bike from school, and I didn't go back to school in the afternoon, so after reading of John Lennon's conduct at school, he quote unquote inspired me not to go back to school. But I'm not encouraging that, by the way, if there's any young people listening. But I think it was just this sort of, I mean, I think with the Beatles, it was the early stuff was the energy and the way it just kind of, and the way they were produced. So you had an instant, Hard Day's Night, you had that chord, I Feel Fine, you had the feedback, She Loves You, you had the drum fill. And then just the journey of 63 to 69, it just seems so all encompassing. And I think another early book was the complete recording sessions by Mr. Lewison.
Wow. Well, yes.
Just all those things. I mean, I was just absolutely captivated. And I went through a sort of 2-3 year journey of just full immersion and never looked back really. And then at the point where I kind of knew all their music, suddenly you've got isolated tracks and then all these Beatles podcasts turn up and there's all these books and it seems like the story is never going to end really, don't you think?
I think so, yeah, but there's so much there to, it's strange. What was it? Someone was saying that you go into it thinking, well, and some people will say, well, there can't be much there, and then suddenly you find that the more you dig, the more there is there to actually pull out of that short period, especially with John. I mean, unfortunately, we lost John when we did, but there's just so much there still to be able to get from that little time that he was there.
Yeah, I mean, he packed so much into his life. I mean, yeah, it's funny to think, isn't it? Because, I mean, his solo career was basically, I suppose you could say it started in 69. I disregard the two versions, Life with the Lions, to some extent, but let's say his pop rock career kind of started with Give Peace a Chance and Cold Turkey, and it was 11 years, and then he kind of took 5 years off. Again, as we were saying earlier, he didn't stop playing music, but he didn't have any official releases. So you're talking about 6 years, really, and about 6 or 7 albums. But I think with him, he not only did he pack a lot into his life. I mean, if you look at a sort of calendar of 1969, there's a book called the John Lennon Encyclopedia. I think it was Bill Harry did that. And if you just chart 1969 from January to December, the amount that him and Yoko packed into that 1 year is quite amazing. And I mean, I've been very inspired by him to do that. I mean, I pack a great deal of sort of learning and researching and reading and stuff. I don't like, I remember on the Imagine 88, Aunt Mimi says, he never wasted a single moment. He was always either reading or writing poetry or drawing. And I've kind of emulated that in my own small way. I don't really like wasting time, like watching kind of rubbish on TV. I like to use my time productively. So give him credit for that. But, and I think also so much of the stuff he did was so memorable that, other people could have a sort of mediocre career of 20 years, but it didn't really matter that he had a short career because it was so memorable and it was so packed with incident, So it's yeah.
I think all four of them were like that, though. I think all four of them have got this thing in them where they don't stop. They're always doing something.
Mm. Yeah, I mean,
especially Paul.
Yeah, I mean, what do you? Can I chuck a question back at you? What do you? I'm not a massive aficionado of Paul's solo career, but would you go along with the thing that he's released maybe too much stuff, and maybe if he'd only released 2/3 of it, it might have been better? What do you think about that?
I don't think Paul is the best at choosing what to release sometimes. But when he records so many songs for his albums, sometimes I think his selection process isn't quite so. But it's a tricky one really, because I like the experimentalism of Paul, if I'm being honest. But yeah, the problem with Paul is, but then again, you find that with a lot of artists. You find it with Prince and artists like that who release so much. There can be an oversaturation. You don't allow the public time almost to get used to you not being there. It's a bit like if you put it onto another side. If you had David Bowie, because you had so long between his releases. When he released something, it was like, oh, there's a David Bowie album. So you've almost not got the time with Paul to get that hype, because it's like, oh dear, there's another Paul McCartney album. So yeah.
I mean, there's even a funny parallel with podcasting, because I'm sure you listened to something about the Beatles and the Beatles Naked. I mean, they spaced them out, particularly the Beatles Naked, but they did put out very long podcasts. You know, it could be 2.5 hours. And I mean, personally, I probably went a bit too quickly. I got so focused on 50 episodes. You know, when I got past about 30, I was like, I want to do 50 episodes, and I absolutely raced them out. You know, because some of mine are pretty long; they could be up to 2 hours, and then I took a month off, or I had a sort of energy crash, which wasn't totally unexpected. But then I took a month off, and some of my listeners who sort of give me quite regular feedback, and we become sort of online friends. They said, "Oh, you know, there's no rush, because you know you got to give people time to catch up." So I think you're right. Paul's been a bit like that, but I think, was it Larry King? It was an interview where he said, "Well, in the end, I'm doing it for myself," which I thought was wonderfully honest.
Yeah.
Do you remember that? I think that was a Larry King interview.
I think so. But you've also got the thing that Paul's already got instilled in there from, because I was saying to Tom and Andy from Two Legs that if you think about it, when during the Beatles, they were always either get an album recorded, record single and a B-side, or on tour. So there was always that work ethic where it's famously said in all the biographies, even back then, they had very few days off having something to do. And so I think Paul was the one who probably had that instilled in him more than the others. The others liked to relax, whereas Paul liked to just get on. And I think he got used to that. So that when Brian died, and I think that Paul, John famously called Paul Beetlehead, didn't he? And and that was because Paul had already got that instilled, and he thought that because he was the one who wanted to always be going into the studio, always wanted to be doing something or other, and which is commendable. But the problem is that they tired of it and really wanted Paul to lay off a bit, and they wanted to relax. And so I think that's the difference between Paul and the others, and I think that says a lot about Paul's work ethic with releasing albums, where he releases and works so much. Yeah,
and I mean, there's no, why shouldn't he? I mean, that's the other thing. There's always been this strange relationship since modern fame was kind of invented, if you want to call it that. I suppose it was around the 40s or the 50s where this sort of mega fame started, and obviously it's so much more now with the saturation of media. There's this strange relationship where, because someone makes money from doing a particular job, such as being a musician, they're somehow indebted to the public, not only to give up all their privacy, but to somehow do their job for other people. The guy can do what he wants, and if he wants to put out an album, then why not? I think it depends really from the artist's point of view. It depends on how bothered about their reputation they are. And I'm sure that, Paul is a little bit careful in his interviews. We know that. So he's probably fairly conscious of his image, but I'm sure on another level, he just kind of says, what the hell, and just puts it out. And, it's up to him at the end of the day. Wouldn't you agree?
I do.
He doesn't owe it to the public to put more or less albums out,
I do, but sometimes I think he takes a bit too much notice to responses to things that he's put out, and then if something doesn't go well, sort of like I don't know how much you know about Paul's albums or what he's released, but something like the Press to Play album in '86, he took that very, very personally the backlash from that album, and even a really good album like the Wings album, Back to the Egg, in '79, that didn't go down very well. So it's almost like he's ignored these, but not realised that there's things on those that were interesting, and he could have carried on with that, but because of the backlash from him trying to experiment and try something new, and people not liking that, he has a tendency to try and go back to being liked, shall we say.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose when I said I'm not a public figure, obviously, but I suppose when you're a public figure, your entire view of the world is totally different, and you've just, because all people are really seeing is your image. I mean, obviously he's expressing his personality through his songs, but other than that, we're just seeing essentially a projection of an image. So I imagine it goes in waves. I'm sure there's times where he just does not care what the public thinks. And then there's other times where he's thinking, well, what's Bowie doing? Or sorry, when Bowie was around, sorry. What's what's Elton John doing? What's I think John Lennon went kind of through the same thing, because another the kind of untruths that John Lennon said. He said at various times that he didn't care what the others were doing, but anyone who's heard the audio diary from '79, he's talking about Jagger and Dylan and McCartney. I think some people would say competition's natural. I mean, that's another tangent for another day probably, but I guess they can't help it, So I think Paul is doing it for himself, but I think perhaps if you're a public figure, it's just too difficult not to have an eye on what's being written about you or what your competitors are doing. So, am I right in thinking that he's never played any of Press to Play live? Is that right?
Absolutely, no. He's never played any of the songs of that album.
Yeah, that seems too much of a coincidence, because there's, from memory, that was actually one of the first studio. I think that may have even been the first of his studio albums I ever owned. So I've got a special memory. And in those days, when you got cassettes and things, and it wasn't a case of downloading. You were buying a cassette, and you'd play it and play it and play it, for weeks and weeks and weeks. And I actually really loved a lot of that album. Is there a song called Footprints?
There is, that he wrote with Eric Stewart.
I mean, that's absolutely lovely. I love that. And
all the guitar, that's beautiful.
Stranglehold, and there's a song called Only Love Remains, which is absolutely beautiful.
Recorded live as well, that.
Oh, was it? Yeah. I mean, I'm amazed he's never played that live, but it must be a weird life, eh?
What's your favourite John album then, coming back to John?
I mean, this is very easy. Plastic Ono Band. We just actually did a rundown, one of the shows that hasn't come out yet, but that one, I'd say probably for a fun listen, if you want to call it that, perhaps Imagine, because it's got some of the spirit of Plastic Ono Band, but it's a bit less heavy. But I just love Plastic Ono Band. I think it's such an incredible statement. And of his Beatles albums, I think because the White Album's a double album, you can actually make a John Lennon single album out of just his songs. And I think
him and Paul.
Say again?
Him and Paul, you could make an album from it.
Absolutely. Both. And it's been done, of course, on another podcast.
All right.
Mr. Buskin's podcast, yeah. That wasn't my idea, unfortunately. But,
is that the album that you'd suggest people start with when wanting to listen to John Lennon for the first time?
Oh, probably not. Well, Plastic Ono Band, probably not. No, I'd probably say Imagine. I think Imagine's got a nice mixture of edge and a bit more sort of sweetness. The famous quote, of course, is it's Plastic Ono Band with sugar on top, or syrup, or whatever the quote is. But I'd say definitely Imagine is a good starting point.
On a previous show, I'd actually mentioned, we were talking about the Imagine album, and I said that it was, like you said, it's Plastic Ono Band's spirit, but with a fuller production. Well, much fuller production.
I mean, I don't think there's much wrong with it, to be honest. Just thinking about the track list in my head, I think It's So Hard is a little bit. When I did the show with Jason Barnard, we picked our worst in inverted commas because we kind of said there weren't that many John Lennon songs we didn't like, but I put It's So Hard on my list because it seems just a bit very basic rock and roll without sort of the John Lennon stamp on it particularly. So
it's my least favourite song on that album.
Oh, is it? Yeah. But I mean, other than that, I mean, some people don't like How Do You Sleep because of the sentiment, but if you just take it as a sort of really kind of funky rock song, I mean, I think I love I Don't Want to Be a Soldier. I think it's a brilliant kind of minimalist. I like the anti-war sentiments. There's really nothing on Imagine I don't like particularly. Same as Plastic Ono Band. There's nothing I really don't like on it. Yeah.
I think we've touched on it earlier, but what do you think is the biggest misconception about John?
Well, yeah, I was trying to think about this. This was the only question I'm really struggling to answer because I don't. I would have probably said, you know, if we'd been here sort of, I don't know, 20 years ago, I probably would have said the misconception was that he was kind of a hard nut. But now I think that's been kind of dismantled. So it's very hard to say. I mean, I did one thing that springs to mind. Earlier this year, I interviewed Colin Hanton, my second Quarryman that I've had on the show. And I actually went to his house in Liverpool, and it was the most surreal couple of hours, but it was delightful. Colin was absolutely great. Because he's got a new book out called Prefab, which I think came out last year. And it was very interesting that perhaps one misconception that's still there is that John Lennon got into a lot of fights when he was young. Yeah. But Colin Hanton's book is full of the quarrymen running away from the local hard nuts, you know, the Teds. And as I said to Colin, I don't blame them because some of the stuff that's described, you know, they would have razor blades on their lapels, and Liverpool was a rough place in those days. Even, and probably not Wilton where John Lennon lived, but you know, if you went to neighbouring Garston or somewhere like that, there's actually the Garston swimming paths were called the bloodbaths, right? Because they were so rough. But yeah, I'd say the misconception was that he got into a lot of fights when he was a teenager. Perhaps another thing that's sort of come out in recent years is that he was very into sort of quite old-timey music. As we know, Paul was, of course, music hall and stuff. And I don't think John was as seeped in it as Paul was, but I think that's perhaps people think that maybe he only liked rock and roll, but I think he sort of liked the crooners and the soppy ballads more than he would have liked to have admitted. Because, you know, John Lennon, in one of his very last interviews, the Andy Peebles one, 2 days before he died, he even says, you know, I still feel like I need to be the macho guy, even though he'd almost been turned into a feminist by Yoko. There was still that little bit of him that didn't want to admit that. And I think that's sort of part of growing up. I think as I've got older, I mean, in my 40s now, I think Paul, to me, is cooler than I thought he used to be, because my idea of what's cool is different. You know, now I think him putting Honey Pie and Martha My Dear on the White Album, it isn't uncool, it's cool in a way, or Wild Honey Pie, you know, that crazy song that's on side one of the White Album. I think the idea of what's daring and what's dangerous changes as you get older, and that's one thing. So I think, you know, if you'd bumped into John Lennon as a teenager, you might have found him quite intimidating. But I think if you penetrated a little bit, you know, and got to know him a little bit, you'd probably find he was mostly a sort of a softie, you know, with just a little bit of a hard edge. Yeah. That's my best guess.
I think that the famous quote from John where he was talking about Paul's granny music, as he called it. I've always thought that was John trying to look macho, shall we say, because he also liked music from back then as well. But it's like somebody being asked about a certain pop group, and because they're trying to look cool to their friends, they'll go, I don't like that because it's just, you know, writing it off. Whereas actually, I think John actually did like it. I mean, otherwise, he wouldn't have done such a great job on the guitar on, as you mentioned, Honey Pie, because his guitar work on that it's exemplary. It's really good.
Yeah, it's amazing that he does a solo that's about only 6 notes or something like that, but it's so memorable, isn't it?
But it's perfect for the song, for that time frame that it's trying to emulate.
Absolutely, yeah. What's there's a word for that, isn't it? Is it forbidden pleasures or something? What's that word where you like something but you're embarrassed by it? God, I'm an English teacher, Martin.
It's that guilty pleasure.
Guilty pleasure.
I don't like the word guilty pleasure. Yeah.
I'm the English teacher, and you're the one who told me what the phrase was. I've been working hard today, so that's my excuse.
I'll let you. All those kids, doing it.
It was actually adults I teach.
All right.
I'm teaching adults. English to foreign adults, but yeah.
I wish I could rewind.
Just a couple of other things while you were talking, I was thinking about that. Yeah, it's a shame that the Lennon Remembers, this December 1970 interview, is used so much. I mean, obviously, we lost John fairly early, so there's not a whole bunch of interviews from the 90s and beyond that can be used. But I remember when I watched the anthology in the mid-90s, I watched it with my then girlfriend, and she wasn't a huge Beatles fan, but she liked them. But she said at the end of it, God, that John Lennon's always moaning, isn't he? And the reason was because they'd used so many of these, so much of the Lennon Remembers quotes in the anthology, which is a shame. But I think he comes across in that interview as really kind of like a child, sort of a bit spiteful and, But the only other misconception I could think of, I mean, I just, the Radio Times came through my door today, and John Lennon's on the cover. And I leaf through a couple of pages, and I think we're going to get the very much official version of John Lennon, 1980. Which, as if you've listened to my show, people will know I endlessly talk about the Ray Coleman and the Albert Goldman versions of John Lennon. And as I said, I'm just reading Ken Womack's new book, and hopefully Ken's going to find a kind of middle ground, because I think the sort of baking bread, domestic happiness meme has been smashed, but I don't think the truth was as dark as Goldman had it. So I think there's something in the middle, but I think we're going to very much get the official version this week or the next couple of weeks. Yeah.
I'm sort of interested in finding out what the radio program that Sean is doing. I'm interested in finding out what comes out in that, if anything.
Yeah, I'm not. I think if Julian's on it, I think unless Julian is sort of not changing his story, but unless Julian is watering down what he said before, I think a lot of the interviews he's given are pretty damning about John Lennon as a father. But again, you can't just beat John Lennon with that stick forever. I mean, he was 22. He was a guy in his early 20s who'd just become mega famous, and he did seek to rectify that with his second son. But I don't know. I haven't really heard a lot of what Sean said. I think I always just kind of assumed that again it would be the sort of sanctioned version. But yeah, I'll definitely be tuning into that. And it's a couple of documentaries on Sky Arts. For anyone who's in Britain, Sky Arts is a fantastic channel. Have you ever watched anything from there?
I have. I love that.
Yeah. Oh, isn't it brilliant? Yeah. There's a new one called. It's a new one called Sky Documentaries as well, which is pretty good. But I'll definitely be tuning in. But I won't hold my breath.
Unfortunately, when this episode comes out, that will have already been on.
Oh well.
But you will be able to go back to the BBC iPlayer, and
there you go.
I'm sure Sky will probably have it somewhere to watch again.
Yeah, and these documentaries tend to appear online fairly quickly nowadays as well, don't they?
That's very true.
Yeah.
What's your opinion on the other Beatles, and what's your knowledge of their music like?
I mean, I guess we've talked about Paul a bit, but I mean, he's eternally fascinating to me. I think the fact that he's still around and he's so public, I think I don't know if he's tarnishing his reputation, but I think some of his public appearances and some of his choices of collaborations perhaps weren't the best. But I've recently been listening to the Nagra reels. Some lovely person put them all online, although they've now been taken down, presumably by Apple. But when I had this sort of month off the podcast and I had a couple of weeks off work, I listened very intently to the Twickenham part of those. And I think Paul perhaps doesn't try as hard as some people give him credit, or, well, no, the opposite, really. I don't think he always tries as hard as people accuse him of. I think a lot of what he does is effortless. I mean, I don't feel like Paul spends days and days crafting songs. I think the kernel of it comes to him very easily. And then I think what was probably true in the past when he was smoking a lot of weed was probably that he just didn't put that little effort into it. Because I think most people who write songs will tell you that it's not difficult to write a song once you know how to write songs.
Yeah.
And I think for Paul, because he's so good, I think it's not difficult for him to write, let's say, 7 out of 10, songs that you'd rate 7 out of 10, fairly good. But I think it's almost a choice, really, whether he wants to push that little bit more effort to make it 9 out of 10, or 10 out of 10 even.
Yep.
So, but I think one of my guests said it very well. He's really impossible to know. It's very difficult to know the real guy. So I like him. I personally do take the view that if you took the best sort of half of his solo career, the best 30 or 40 songs, you got some absolute gold there. George, I always found interesting. I always found George, this is going to upset the George fans, in some ways a watered down version of John. In that, not musically, I mean personality wise. And I think he almost said that. He said when John left the Beatles, which I suppose officially was September 1969, he said, I took over as the one who didn't take any shit. So although I don't think when you're in the 50s, the fact that Paul was 9 months older than George, I always found that amazing that he still thought of him as a baby brother, even when they're both in their 50s. But I see George more as a sort of younger brother of John almost. That I think he did look up to John. How their relationship would have played out, I don't know. But George musically, I've always found very interesting. I like a lot of his Beatles stuff. I really like stuff like Don't Bother Me. I think that's very, very underrated. And as a person, the more I read about it, I think the sort of grumpy and rather bitter side of George, I think that didn't come out in the Martin Scorsese doc. I think when you're making these documentaries, they tend to be the sort of officially sanctioned version. I'm not knocking that because that, it seems terrible to put out something very negative about someone after they've died. So if a certain truth is going to come out, which is probably going to be mostly positive, obviously, the Goldman book on John Lennon and the Lennon Naked documentary, not documentary, dramatization, they were very negative about John. But and Ringo, I think Ringo would be a great person to be in a band with. I think he was the glue that held the Beatles together. And apart from the Walkout and the White Album, I think it was no surprise to me at all that they all ended up working with him, didn't they? And they all contributed songs to his solo stuff. I mean, that was no surprise. As far as his solo career, I mean, I barely know anything past about 1974, and I did listen to a bit of his recent album, and I just find it hard to take too seriously. I don't know. I think as a drummer, he's fantastic, and
so do I. I think he's very underrated.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know if he's still underrated. I suppose to the casual fan, they X amount of people will still think that he was the guy who won the pool, so to speak. But I think those isolated tracks that have come out through the garage band or rock band.
Yeah.
You know, they've really shown you that the stuff he was doing in the Beatles was fabulous. You know, yeah, that was long-winded, wasn't it?
It was. So, as we're getting towards the end, what other podcast shows do you listen to?
Of different topics or anything?
Of any topic whatsoever. The idea is that, well, my idea behind this is that people might hear shows that you like, and they might think, oh, I'll have a listen to that and see what that's like. So, what do you actually listen to?
Well, I mean, I still listen to Joe Rogan Experience. For history buffs, I couldn't recommend more Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. He's you know, they're pretty long episodes. But
that's the second time I've had that
mentioned. Oh, have you? Who else mentioned that?
Who mentioned it?
One of your...
It might have been. I don't remember. I wish I'd taken notes now.
Oh, okay. No, that's a great one. He's Dan Carlin's got a great voice, and you can really hear that he's into it, you know. And there's one called Clandestine, which I listen to, which is again a sort of alternative view of media in the world. There's one called The Mind Renewed, which I've actually appeared on 5 or 6 times, run by Julian Charles, who's a friend of mine. Recommend that. Musically, I mean, Ben Burrell's one, Bob Dylan album by album, is great, and his other one called Long Player.
I think Ben's Bob Dylan one. I was saying to Ben that I like the fact that it's informative while not being too long, so it gets the information out there, and it's succinct at the same time. Yeah,
definitely. And I think I said in another show, when I talked to Ben, I love the way he referred to Dylan as Bob instead of Dylan, and you could sort of hear the affection in Ben's voice when he was talking about Bob.
That's right.
Film ones I listen to quite a lot. There's one called The Next Reel, which is pretty good, and there's one called the Essential Films podcast. They're pretty good. And then obviously Beatles. Oh dear, I think everyone that you've interviewed or about to interview, I've probably listened to all of theirs. I mean, I love, if you really want something different, I really like Fabcast. That's an interesting one. Very forthright opinions. And then When They Was Fab, I listened to Nothing Is Real. That's the 2 Irish guys. That's pretty good. And then, you know, as I said, all the people that you've interviewed, two legs. I'm hesitant about mentioning any of them because then I might forget the rest of them. But they know who they are.
They know who they are.
But podcasting is such a wonderful thing. I mean, to produce a podcast is hard work, but very rewarding. But listening to podcasts, as I said right at the beginning, it's like a radio show with all the boring bits taken out. And
well, let's hope I do a good job of editing.
I'm sure you will. Yeah, I mean, I wish you good luck, and you know, you've already got some great people on the names that I've seen, and you will find you'll hit your stride pretty quickly, and it's a great learning curve, and it's a great adventure. So good luck to you.
Thank you very much. What advice would you give then to first-time podcasters?
Right. Well, first of all, go for it. Do it. Don't procrastinate too long like I did. I was thinking about this. A podcast should be different to a radio show in the sense that I don't think it should be too slick. However, there are podcasts that I've listened to that there's nothing wrong with a long podcast, but some of them do just endlessly ramble. And I think there's ones I've listened to, film ones, for example. Not going to mention any names, but that it does just sound like a load of blokes chatting about a film, but that haven't really done any research. So I think my advice would be try to find that sweet spot where it's organic and, you know, it's informal. Like, it shouldn't be slick, but I think it's a good thing to do research. You don't want it to be you don't want it to sound like something that literally anybody can do. You know, I think that's my personal belief anyway. So I think if you do the research and then trust yourself that, it's going to work, and that you and your guests or you on your own can carry the episode. I think find a sweet spot between informal and somewhat polished or somewhat smooth. Yeah, that's my advice.
Thank you for that, Anthony. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
And that was fun.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me on, and good luck once again.
Another one in the can.
Another one in the can. Another one in the bag.
Right. Thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you everybody for listening, and hope that you carry on and listen again. Thank you very much.
I think now I'm on video, can you see where you can see me in the top right hand corner? You've got some dots, blue dots, 3 blue dots, top right hand corner of the window where you can see my face.
No, I can't in this, no.
Oh,
yes. All I can see is...
well, can you see me? Can you see my face?
I can see you, yes.
Okay. In the top right-hand corner, is there there's not 3 blue... If you click in the top right-hand corner, can you see a blue square and three dots?
No, I've got the bit that says view.
Oh. There's not 3 dots. Oh, it's a shame.
Cross over to the other side, it's got the recording and that bit. That's strange.
Oh. So in the rectangle where I am, nothing.
Yes, I can. Yeah. Nothing.
Oh. It's a shame.
So I've right-clicked and I'm pressing that allow to record.
Oh, have you done that?
I've done it, yeah. I've just right-clicked and it's come up as a drop-down menu.
Yeah, I'm recording. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay.
So I'm recording and you're recording, so between us. Are you recording on Zoom as well, or just Audacity?
Just on Zoom.
Oh, on Zoom. Okay, perfect. So we're both recording on Zoom, so it should be fine. I'm just going to...
For the future, I need to find out something.
I'm just checking that this is automatically adjusting, and I want to make sure I don't sit too near the mic. So, yeah, I'm ready when you are, mate.
Because the first person I did it with last week, he actually hosted, and he was able to get Zoom to give him 3 audio files.
Oh, that's interesting.
So he had a file of everything all together, both me and him talking, and then he had 2 separate files that Zoom gave him of each different microphone. So you could then edit both one or the other. Yeah, I've not worked out yet how to do that with Zoom.
I mean, I'll have a look after we've finished. And I'll let you know. But whenever I record, it spits out an audio file, a video file, and then something that just says playback, which I don't even know what that is. But
right, okay.
Yeah, but you'll get an audio. Obviously, you won't need the video file, but you'll get it's an MP4, isn't it? And then
it is.
Yeah.
Well, I never know what for A order.
Yeah, M4A, that's it. I'm ready when you are.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello and welcome to Pods Like Us. My name is Martin Quibell, known to my friends as Marv. I'm with...
Oh, yeah, I've got it.
Go on.
No, I've got to tell you how to pronounce my surname. So
that's a really good idea, because I think I've got it wrong when I say Antony Rotunno.
Oh, that's correct, yes. Sorry I interrupted you. Go on, start again. I'm sorry. I'm going to keep quiet now. Rotunno, yeah.
Rotunno, okay.
Yeah. Okay, sorry.
I know most of my time over the next couple of weeks is going to be spent with endless editing.
I mean, I do.
How am I going to fit that around the 70-hour week?
Yeah, I mean, like I said to you, I spend a long time doing it. It's kind of worth it because what I do is I edit the conversation, then I go back to the beginning and I listen to it through. And then while I'm listening to it, I think about what I'm going to put in my intro. But I think when you hear the conversation back and it's nice and smooth, it does give you a kind of a warm glow, Sort of feels like it's worth it.
Well, I've got the A4 pad out to take numerous notes of each episode.
If you need any advice, just shoot me a message because I'm more than happy. I'm sure you'll find that with everybody. They're more than happy to.
Yeah,
to
even
help
Andy
you.
Nichols said to me last night, he said, if need be, he says, throw me one or two of them, he says, and I'll edit them and whatever he said. I don't know about that.
Have you done much editing with Audacity before?
Only on music, never on
Okay.
this.
I mean, it's pretty user friendly. Oh, actually, Martin, you tell you what, have you got any mastering software?
I don't know whether I can do mastering in Reaper.
Right, because I've got there's a weird sort of software called, I'll write it in our chat, Levelator. I've written it in the chat there.
Okay.
What it's supposed to do is level out the voices. But what I find, it doesn't totally level them out, but it has a funny effect of mastering it. It comes out louder than it was originally.
Okay.
But just make sure if you're using that, make sure before you put it through Levelator, make sure it's nowhere near the red. Yeah. Because if you use Levelator, it might go into the red. So,
well, then you get really distortion.
Yeah, I mean, I always err on the side of having the level further down rather than up. Yeah. Because then you can always sort of put it up a bit. But if it goes in the red, then then it's a problem. But yeah, Levelator, it's pretty good. So if you download Levelator and you have it on your desktop, you literally just drag the file into Levelator and then you'll see the percentage and then it'll spit it back out with the word output on it.
Okay.
So yeah, I think that's a pretty good bit of software.
That's good.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anthony. I'll let you get on because you've got something on shortly, haven't you?
Yeah, I've got to go out.
Okay.
Do some errands. Yes.
Well, I'll catch up with you later on. Thanks very much, mate.
When do you think when are you planning to put them all out? Is it just a steady progress?
Steady progress.
All right. Yeah. Like I say, if there's anything you need just shoot me a message.
Okay. Thank you, Anthony. Catch you later.
All the best,
care, mate.
Bye.
Bye.
See you.